can all see that okay. So in the spirit of Helen and I trying to get a tiny bit more organised and professional at the start of these sessions, we thought it would always be useful just to remind you that we now have pod notes and pod sheets every week for each new episode, available on amazingif.com. So the idea with these is pod notes is really, we put this on Instagram. It's often a summary of a key idea that hopefully people can try out. So an idea for action, a tool to try out. So this week, for example, we summarized the different types of question, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And I know some people already using these. The pod sheet is designed to be a kind of interactive worksheet that you can download, and then you can fill in. You can either print off to fill in, but you can actually fill it in online as well. So it's got things like, it's actually quite small there, so I'll make it a bit bigger. But you can see we ask you some coach yourself questions. We put our recommended resources there. You'll see here lots of the ideas for action up here, and a bit of a summary as well. So essentially this is us taking a bit of the preparation that we do for the podcast and then trying to turn it into something that we hope feels really useful. And that word useful is really important to us. It's one of our values at Amazing If. It's why we do these things. So if you are using them, please always give us any feedback, like let us know, are they helpful? Are you sharing them? Is there anything else that we're missing that would be good? So just to let you know they're there, and each week we'll give you a quick screenshot just to kind of remind you while we're all getting used to having these extra resources. The other thing that I have often started to do now that we're at 216 episodes is I often think it's helpful to connect the dots between the episode that we've done and some other episodes that might be helpful if you're trying to kind of bring together a bit of knowledge and expertise on a topic. So this week we were talking about how to ask better questions, and I was scanning ones that we've done before. I think if I was going to dive a bit deeper into this topic, quite useful to listen to number 114, 115, which was 20 career questions to ask yourself at the end of 2020. It wasn't really specific to 2020, it was just career questions. So if you're thinking, well, I'd like to ask myself some questions about my career rather than just questions at work, that might be a useful one to, or useful too, to think about. I think questioning and listening do kind of go hand in hand. So anything on listening is really helpful. And then if you're like me, one of the ways that I use questions is to improve my ability to have constructive, kind of challenging conversations. So number 98 was all about courageous conversations. And so if you're thinking, well, what will you use questions for? So what are you hoping to ask better questions for, kind of in service of what? And for me, it is often a way to navigate more tricky conversations that I'm finding a bit harder. So connecting some dots there in case it's helpful. You can also search on our website now for specific topics for the podcast, because again, we know that it's a lot of episodes. And if you use an app like Overcast, that also allows you to search as well. So that's what I was doing this morning. I was popping up into search and just seeing what I could find. So question for all of you to get us started for today. Do you think, if you were thinking about your capability at the moment, do you feel like you are better at listening over here or asking questions? If you were to kind of have to hang your hat on one of those two skills, where do you think your capability is the highest? Asking insightful questions or your kind of active listening? I don't even need to give instructions anymore, which is very nice. But for Glenn, who's here for the first time, he'll be thinking, what is happening on screen? If you go to the top of your screen, view options, annotate, stamp, and then you'll be able to put stars, or as some people are doing, hearts or ticks on our screen. If you can't do it because you're perhaps on your phone or you're out for a walk, don't worry at all. But I think we're about 50-50 at the moment. Just give everyone a second to remember where all the buttons are. Helen, which one do you think you're better at? Listening or asking questions?
Do you know what we should like I'll tell you and then you tell me.
Oh no, we should talk about this beforehand.
I don't mind you giving me some live feedback, it's fine. I think
feedback.
I'm better at asking questions than I am at listening.
Yeah, I would agree. But I would also say that I can see you working really hard on your listening. So I know that that's probably less of a natural skill for you, but I see you stop yourself interrupting and things like that.
I think
What
you're pretty
about,
balanced,
you
actually.
think you're a bit
Yeah.
balanced?
Yeah.
I think I use questions as I described. I use questions when I'm stuck or struggling. And I'm at my best listening where I feel comfortable and confident. So I actually think it's a bit situational for me. I think in certain situations I'm better at one versus the other, but kind of good enough at both. But I'm really a bit like Helen, really trying to improve my listening as well. Okay, great. So we've got a bit of a split across the group as well. And so the other question that I was interested in, just before I give you a kind of a quick summary of some of the key concepts, and then Helen's going to talk about a tool, is do you think your ability to ask brilliant questions, insightful questions, do you think it has improved, stayed still, or kind of decreased or got worse over the past 12 months, where I'm imagining most of us have been working remotely? So has working remotely helped, hindered, or actually just stayed the same? So for quite a few of us, stayed the same, which is interesting. A few people saying it's helped, perhaps because I do think sometimes people think, oh, it's harder to have a kind of conversation remotely, but I sometimes, maybe particularly if you're like me and you're an introvert, being on a Zoom call perhaps gives everybody more opportunity to speak, and therefore you've got the opportunity to ask your question. But it is maybe harder to know when someone stops speaking, and that maybe that makes it tougher. Let us know any insights in chat if you've kind of got any insights you want to share about like why it's improved, maybe why it's got harder for you. Let us know. So I'm not assuming, because that's based on my experience, is I think sometimes I'm better at asking questions because I feel like everybody maybe gets a bit more of a turn now. Okay, interesting. But lots of people stay the same. Okay, let's get rid of those ones. And then a few just points I wanted to make and a few questions for you, and we'll head into chat together in a second. This episode really was all about improving your ability to ask better questions. So kind of wherever you are today, you're a 7 out of 10, you're a 6 out of 10, you're a 2 out of 10. What does it take to get from a 2 to a 3, from a 6 to a 7, from an 8 to a 9 even? And I think the first question, kind of a coaching question to ask yourself, is for you, what gets in the way at the moment of you asking questions? What is your specific barrier? So we talked in the podcast about, is it a fear of what other people might think about you? Is it that you feel you should already know the answers? One of the things actually I think that I don't ever struggle with is I never mind kind of feeling like, should I already know this? I always think I'm always happy to ask the question because I want to know the answer. And you know that thing of when you ask it, there's always someone else who wants the answer to that question as well. And I think I learned that quite early in my career. So I'm always happy to ask that question. But I know that can be quite a big barrier. Just sometimes you find it harder to ask questions if people are more senior, perhaps that stops you kind of asking a question. So maybe let's just head into chat, because I'd love to hear from everybody. Oh, I've just pressed the weird button there. Let me know what stops you asking a question. Yeah, so Hayley saying there, a new, like not only new people, but also new senior people, that kind of combination. Time, Catherine, I think that's a really good observation. Both Helen and I think find that is when we're struggling for time, you close down rather than open up, don't you? Because you're trying to get stuff done. Yeah, seniority, Leon, yeah. Reg, when you're not comfortable in a group, yeah, I can understand that. Yeah, Sophia, so maybe thinking you should know this. Great observation there by Kirsty. We actually talked about this on the podcast this week, where questions can be frustrating because you know you've got to get stuff done. And so actually, if you feel someone else's frustration when you ask a question, maybe it means you don't do it next time. Tanya saying, yeah, you don't need to be the expert. Love that. Happy to press pause. Great phrase. Shelley, yeah, that's hard if you're shut down. So you are brave enough to ask the question and then it gets closed down. Richard, really good insight there. I don't think we actually talked about that in the podcast. We talked about the people who are brilliant at asking questions are often confident, concise, and kind of have that clarity. But also, to your point, that can stop us asking questions. You just feel like you've not got, you're not clear about what it is that you're trying to say, so then you don't say anything at all. Sometimes it takes me a bit of talking out loud to get to what is the question that I'm trying to ask, and therefore someone's got to listen to that thinking. Okay, so it's always helpful, I think, to make this relevant for you to figure out for yourself, what is your biggest barrier, what perhaps holds you back the most, because then you can work out what actions might you try out to kind of really help improve your questioning kind of ability. And then just a couple of specific things I wanted to pick out from the podcast. A really simple thing to try out that I think probably benefits all of us is this idea of asking one question at once. I'm sure if you listen to the podcast, you listen to Helen and I interviewing, often when, to Richard's point, we're struggling to know what we're trying to say, perhaps we're a bit lost in a conversation, or maybe we've just got lots of ideas happening at the same time, we start doing kind of question stacking. We ask lots of questions at once. And the problem with doing that is the person answering, is very unlikely to remember all of those questions and can do one of two things in response. They can either choose which question they want to answer, so maybe they avoid the difficult question, or they just answer the one that they remember, which is usually the last question that you asked. So particularly, I think if you're in coaching conversations, mentoring conversations, very informal kind of you're supporting people conversations, just asking one question at once actually allows someone to have more depth of insight, and you'll get a better quality answer. You'll help somebody else's thinking to improve by doing one at once. Doesn't mean you can't ask multiple questions, but then you can build and you can develop each time. So try and see how often you do that. I know that I definitely do. You start to really realize it's actually quite a hard skill to practice. It's one of those things that's simple and hard at the same time. The other thing that I think is really worth noticing for yourself is what kinds of questions do you ask the most? We talked about loads of different types in the podcast. Just a few examples here for you. We talked about adjoining questions, which is when you kind of connect the dots and ask, well, how would this impact this team? Or what would the implications be for this project over here? So you start from where you are and you connect some dots and you ask some questions that help other people to do that. Are those the kind of questions that you ask? Or do you ask something like lots of elevating questions? Elevating questions often help you to step back, to get perspective, to kind of see the whole, to see the wood from the trees. I ask quite a lot of those questions, and those ones can sometimes be met with frustration because you're essentially pressing pause and you're just asking, and they're often quite hard questions to answer as well. Let's remind ourselves of like really what's the problem or the purpose that we're trying to work towards here. And that slows everyone down. It makes everybody kind of come out of the detail or the task that you're trying to complete. So figure out what's your natural style of questioning. And then you can start to figure out, well, when is that most useful? But also, when might I want to practice asking some different styles of questions, adapt our style to be useful and to do our job brilliantly.
Steve's got a really good Sarah, hang on, sorry. Steve's got a really good point around how do you handle, I don't know if I've got the answer to this, how do you manage question stacking in an email? So let's say you're getting in touch with a client or a customer and you actually have got multiple things that you want to ask, but they might only answer one of the questions. It's interesting, isn't it? I guess
that is really interesting. I suppose and I'm sure most people would do this, I'd give space between the questions. So I try and almost like space it out in terms of how someone's reading it. So you either go bullet points or just spacing. I think the other thing I would do is ask the most important question first. I think I try and make sure I've prioritized them in my own head before I then put them down into words, because of course you can't just send 7 emails if you've got 7 questions. Like that's just really unrealistic. But I probably would try and go, the most important question for us to clarify or to get a response on at the moment is, and maybe even use that language and actually just be really specific about this is where we need to start, or just order them like 1, 2, 3 that way.
Yeah.
The last thing I just wanted to ask all of you before I hand over to Helen is for a bit of borrowed brilliance. So we talked in the podcast at the end about who do you notice asks really brilliant questions that we can learn from. So I think I even spotted Emma Barnett's name coming up in chat already today. She used to be on 5 Live. She's now host of Women's Hour on Radio 4. So she's a really brilliant questioner and manages to sort of stay very calm, even when she's got some quite kind of tricky conversations happening. Emma Gannon's podcast, she asked some really good questions. Helen talked about Elizabeth Day. Is there anyone else who you just noticed from the podcast that you listen to, the things that you watch, things that you kind of see on TV? Who else do you think does a brilliant job of asking questions, not necessarily in a work context? And let's get some borrowed brilliance from those people and from each other. And I'll stop sharing.
Gilbert. I think she does everything brilliantly.
She does do everything really well, doesn't she? Michael Hussein, yeah. Viv Groskop, yeah, she is. It's interesting, isn't it, Tanya? We talked on the podcast about people who they're almost their profession relies on being brilliant at asking questions. And it's interesting that like Viv, Michael, Elizabeth Day are all journalists. And I feel like journalism, like one of the ways to be a brilliant journalism is to get very good at asking really good questions. So I actually feel like we could probably learn a bit from journalists. Maybe we should try and get a journalist on, Helen, talking about questions. That'd be really interesting.
Yeah, it would be interesting. I'm sure we know someone.
Sophie Ridge. I don't know who that is, James. I'm going to be honest about not knowing and not ask that question. Do you know who that is, Helen?
No, I don't, but I will.
Let us know, James, who that is.
I'll look after the Sunday Breakfast on Sky.
Oh, I don't have Sky. That's why I don't know. Okay, so get another journalist example there. Brilliant. Helen, I'll hand over to you for the tools for today.
I've got one that I haven't talked to you about, Sarah. We're going to talk about the depth of questions and the breadth of questions. So Sarah's going to be like, what's she about to do? But before I get my screen up and share, I was just thinking when Sarah was talking, I had a meeting yesterday at the end of the day, and everyone was sort of taking the turns to do their chat. And it was the first time I'd met with these people. And once this person had introduced themselves, I said, oh, I've got a question and a reflection for you. And then what happened was they started mirroring. So after they'd answered that, I'd shared my reflection and I'd asked my question, they then started mirroring that language back to me. And they were like, oh, I've got a reflection on what you just said and a question too. And it made me think about sometimes when you're in a meeting, the importance of signposting that you're asking a question. I used to work with somebody called Liz when I was at Virgin, and she always used to do it. And we used to smile about it. Question for you. It was like it was like a Liz-ism, but it really made the meeting it sort of stopped the meeting in quite a constructive way. It wasn't like an aggressive way, but she's like, question for you, and everyone was like, all right, here's a question. And I think sometimes before I go on to this thing about the depth of questions that you can ask and the breadth of questions, I think if it's something that you really want to discuss, signposting, I've got a question, is actually quite a good way to bring everyone's attention to this thing that you want to discuss. So minor point, but the question reflection thing worked really well yesterday. The planned point that I have for you is all about the depth and the breadth of questions. And you are getting a sneak peek into something that is in our new book here, because someone said in the chat that actually coaches are really good at asking questions. They are, because it's part of that skill set. And our new book is called You Coach You, and it's about how everyone can learn the skills to coach themselves. And so we have obviously covered things like questioning and listening in that book. And one of the things that we talk about in the book, which you're getting a sneak peek out, is the depth of questions. And Sarah and I were thinking about when we're asking different questions at work. Sarah, I'm hoping you can see my screen because I had some problems earlier. All good, thank you. Brilliant. When we were thinking about the types of questions that are useful to ask, what Sarah and I sort of recognise is that there's a different depth of questions. Oh, my iPad is now not wanting to work. Give me 1 second, everybody. I'm having all kinds of tech issues over the past couple of days. Let's just see if this works now. Dun, dun, dun. I feel like it's a big, oh, my pen. Wait, everyone, 1 more minute. Okay, let's try. Yesterday, my tech didn't work and I had to get a giant yellow Post-it note and draw my entire 90-minute session on Post-it notes, which I held to the screen. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. We're back. Depth of questions. So the quality of your questions and the reflection that it drives can be affected by the depth of the question, like the type of the question. And when Sarah and I were thinking about this ourselves, we think that there are 3 depths of questions that help you to unlock different insights. So they are the deep questions, the deeper questions, and the deepest questions. So 3 different levels, and I'll kind of explain it as I go. So these are our deep questions. These are some very badly drawn snorkels. Okay, so the deep questions, this is kind of like level 1 in terms of like where you're kind of diving under the water to ask and find things and discovering new insights. The first level are the deep questions. These questions are very factual. They're like, what's happened? Who is involved? What have we done? You know, they're about gathering facts. They're kind of just below the surface. They get you to a level of insight. The next level goes a little bit deeper. These ones are much more, let me kind of do my little thing here. These ones are much more about feelings. So these ones are about, well, how do you feel about that situation? What did that make you think? How has that kind of affected you? Much more about the feelings. So we start to get some more individual insight about a situation, maybe a little bit more about the emotional impact of something. That can help us to understand other people's perspectives. It can help us to generate empathy. It is, you know, it's a bit deeper. And then the third level, this is the deepest level of questions. So when we start asking these types of questions, what we're really trying to get to is all about understanding people's fears. And to be honest, this can apply to yourself as well as other people. So when you're understanding, well, what are you really worried about here? What's the thing that you're most scared of? What's the worst thing that could happen? What do you think would occur if it all goes wrong? Like often, a lot of our concerns are kind of fear-based, and we might not get to that level. Now, I wouldn't suggest that you start here. If you're having, let's say you're having a one-to-one with your manager, if the first question you ask are, what are your fears about the project if it all goes wrong? That's probably quite a big question to go to. So, you know, just as if you were scuba diving, you might, you know, you gradually go down there. But if you really want to get a lot of insight through the questions that you ask, think about how you go down from facts to feelings to fears, and you'll get much more insight into what someone might be thinking and what might be going on in a situation. So this is the first time that we've kind of shared this with people. So let us know if that resonates with you, this idea of kind of the different levels of depth for question and going from fact to feeling to fears. Yeah, really good reflection there from Reg in the chat. So much of work is around here because it's quick. It's quick. What happened? Who did it? What do we need to do next? When have we done it before? It's quick, this level, but it's shallow, right? That's the point here. It's a shallow level of questions. And if we're trying to get insight to understand and get empathy, we need to dive a little bit deeper. So the other thing I wanted to talk about was, that's kind of the depth of the questions. The other thing I wanted to talk about was about the breadth of the questions. So what I was reflecting on this morning, actually, when I was preparing for this, is I was trying to think about how you need to match your questions to the situations that you're in. And I was thinking about my work day. What are the situations that I'm in when I ask questions? And I would imagine this is kind of similar to your work day. So for example, I will ask questions in like one-to-one. So if I was at work and I was with Sarah, or kind of, you know, in Microsoft when I was a manager, there'd be a one-to-one kind of conversation where some questions would arise. There'd also be like team meetings where we'd kind of be asking questions about what people are doing at the moment, that kind of thing. And then for us in Amazing If, we have clients, but if I was at Microsoft, it'd be my stakeholders, you know, like other people in the business, or maybe it'd be with customers. I was thinking these are probably the 3 main contexts for my questions. And when I was thinking about that, I was thinking, well, each of those contexts have a different, they have a different objective in terms of my questions. So let me kind of share my thoughts. And again, I'd love to know if it resonates. So I was thinking in one-to-ones, a lot of my questioning objective is about clarifying. I want to understand, you know, have I got my requirements right? Am I clear on what we need to do and when we need to do it? A lot of my objective in one-to-ones is, you know, clarifying questions. In teams, it's much more about collaboration. It's much more about how could we do this? What are we working on? What are we doing together? It's much more how can I help? It's much more kind of collaborative in terms of the questions and what I'm trying to get to. And then with clients, what I'm really trying to do is get kind of lots of curious questions. You know, what's your priority? What's most important to you at the moment? What would good look like for you at the end of the project? Much more curious. This is like my question intent. And then I thought, well, okay, if that's your intent, how do you really focus on asking the right questions? And where I got to was in one-to-ones, I think these questions are very I focused. Okay, what can I do? What do I need to do to move this thing forward? These are the questions that I'd be asking in a one-to-one. So I'm taking ownership out of that question. It's very much I focused questions because I'm clarifying there my roles, my responsibilities, what I'm accountable for. These more collaborative team sort of based discussions, I think those questions are much more we focused. What could we do to move this forward? How could we improve on what we did before? And so I'd really think going into those meetings about, you know, really focusing on we questions. And then I think these ones are much more about you and your. What is your priority over the next 12 months? What is the one thing that you want to get out of this meeting today? Because I'm trying to put myself in my client, my customer, my stakeholder's shoes. And I think this just helps you to be a bit more specific about the situation that you're in, because not all the same, you know, not all questions are going to have the same value in the different situations that you're in. So just be a bit more specific about it and maybe a bit more confident about your questioning, because you can think, okay, this is a one-to-one, I'm going to focus on the I. It's a team situation, it's about we, or it's a client, customer, stakeholder. It's much more about the kind of you and your questions. So I hope that helps. I don't have kind of more than that, but I think just thinking about the depth of your questioning so that you can get to that insight, and also the breadth of questioning so that you're using it specifically, it might just help you to unlock another bit of insight on it. So I will stop sharing there.
One thing, Helen, I just wanted to mention, I listened to Graham Norton talk to Elizabeth Day this week on how to fail, and he talked about what he thinks makes him good at asking really good questions. It's worth listening to, actually, in the context of questions, kind of knowing, you know, we go back to that things about purpose. What's the purpose of the conversation? And because for him, he said, actually, I'm not doing a good job if it ever becomes about me. So, you know, that's not relevant. All the time we talked about adapting, but I think because I was thinking about this and listening to that at the same time, I think he's an interesting person to listen to, because he just asks, he meets so many people and he asks lots of different questions.
Brilliant.
A tough one-to-one. Good luck, Leon.
Yeah, good luck. Have a good rest of your week, everyone. Next week's podcast is on progression, particularly with Sophie Williams. It's particularly about the inequality of progression and what we need to do to make sure that we kind of make progression fair, open and available for everybody. And there's some really significant biases in the workplace that do not make progression equal for everyone. So that conversation next week is the last in our Ask the Expert series. So we'll be talking about that.
Is it next week we don't have Pod Plus?
Thank you. Next week we don't have Pod Plus. Thank you for that, everybody. That's because I think we have a diary clash. Sorry, we're trying to avoid ever doing that, but I think there's something unavoidable next week. So we won't be doing Pod Plus next week, but we will be back the week after.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Take care. Bye, everyone.